Hello, this is Matthew Eric Kump with the Committee for the Republic of Canada. With me here is Avneet Thapar with also the Committee for the Republic of Canada. And we're here at the very last day of the International Economic Conference of the Americas, which was a 3-day event brought here to Montreal, Canada. It's the 20th anniversary of this event, which was originally established in 1994 by Paul Desmarais of Power Corporation with his London affiliates, a grouping of privy councillors and those affiliated with Henry Kissinger and George Bush Sr., to usher in the new age of NAFTA, which had then in 1994 just been sealed as a treaty. Now, it being the 20th anniversary of that disaster, instead of it being an apology for dire mistakes that have led to the destruction of nation-states and the world's biggest economic collapse, obviously there's been a lack of humility, and instead what we've seen in the course of our interventions here has been nothing but thousands of delegates and panelists, the likes of Christine Lagarde, Larry Summers, saying that the problem with the world isn't that we've had too much free trade and too much speculation, but rather
too
little. Yeah, not enough. So I'm going to ask Avneet here to just go through a few of the key points that we addressed and forced onto the table throughout the preceding 2 days at this conference.
Yeah, well, I think Matthew and myself were the only ones who pointed at the complete silliness and stupidity of the lack of two important global economic players in the world situation right now, which is Russia and China. Mm-hmm. Because if you're having a conference, a global economic conference, and you're not only not inviting but not at all mentioning Asia right now, especially Eurasian nations, Russia, China, India, it doesn't have to be. It's more than just oblivion or ignorance. It's an intention to push free trade down the throat of these nations and to reject what these nations are doing, to ignore and to play down the significant impact these nations are having on the global economic situation right now, which is moving away from free trade, moving towards development, physical economic development of these regions' internal economy, right? So, even the recent Russia-China gas deal, the $400 billion gas deal that they just signed 2 weeks ago, I think, which would be a 30-year project, one of the biggest infrastructure projects ever to be built, this was played down as not being that important. But something that in reality would not just change the price of natural gas in Asia and globally, something that other nations would want to participate in, that even Japan right now wants to participate in, that will force Japan to reject Obama's war propaganda against China and be forced to work with China.
That was a point that you even brought up in one of the panels that was chaired by Pascal Lamé, where everyone there was talking about the fact that CETA, the TPP, were the new harbingers of the new age of peace and prosperity, and one of the panelists, I believe a French journalist, gave a little intervention on that too.
Yeah, one of the panelists, he's a French journalist with the Liberation magazine. It's a European magazine. He's based out of Brussels. He was the only panelist throughout the entire 3-day event, other than the Icelandic president, who brought up the fact that, well, let's face it, these free trade deals are an attack on China. And we know it, and the Chinese know it. But we feel uncomfortable saying it. But the Chinese know it, and that's why China's pushing for the complete opposite, which is bilateral agreements with other nations on economic projects, on nation states cooperating for development, not mega corporations and bankers from London cooperating for looting these nations.
Mm-hmm. That brings up another question that you were able to ask towards the end of the conference in front of a major auditorium where the key speaker was the president of Iceland. Most people, I think the topic was on the Arctic.
The panel was Arctic development, and the Icelandic president was the only sane voice of reason throughout the event. It was a very polarized event. Compared to the presentations by Larry Summers and Christine Lagarde, this guy was very, very reasonable. He was very rational, and he made it the point that we are talking about a panel on the Arctic, but yet there's a lack of participation of Russia. Why is that? Because that's silly. You cannot talk about the Arctic without talking and cooperating with Russia. Mm-hmm. Because Russia is an important player and has been very cooperative with the rest, with Iceland and with the other Arctic nations on the development of Arctic.
Right.
And I mean, because the thing is also, how would you develop the Arctic? You can't do it with solar panels. You can't do it with windmills. You need nuclear power.
Right.
Something that Russia is promoting, floating nuclear reactors. Yeah. Something that if the United States moves with Glass-Steagall, the United States would push for fusion power.
There is also, if I may say so, a kind of hypocrisy in this debate that you refer to. We haven't mentioned Russia very much in this discussion here in your questions and our answers. And we sometimes tend to forget in the Nordic countries, in Canada and the US, that the biggest landmass player in the Arctic is Russia. Together with Greenland, they are the largest reservoir of untapped resources in the Arctic. So it's impossible to engage in a constructive discussion on the Arctic without Russian participation. There's no Russian on this on this panel. I attended a conference in Norway, northern Norway, a few months ago, after the Ukraine crisis started, after the discussion of sanctions got going. And there was a very interesting presentation by a representative of Rosneft, the big Russian oil company, and some of the Russian expert institutions from the oil and gas industry. And even I had to acknowledge that I was not familiar with the comprehensive engagement of many of the largest American oil companies in joint ventures with the Russians inside the Russian Arctic. The biggest players, apart from Russia, in the Russian Arctic, in terms of oil and gas, are American oil companies. We don't hear that very much. And how are you going to execute sanctions in that territory? So we have to be realistic, we have to be informed, we have to realize that there is probably the most capital-intensive infrastructure drilling cooperation in the Arctic is an American-Russian cooperation. That's the fact of the matter. And as we go forward and look at the consequences of crisis in other countries, well, it's very important to realize that. And not sort of kid ourselves about what the reality is. You asked about Greenland. American companies are much more engaged in the Russian Arctic than they are in the Greenland Arctic. That is the political playing field. Then you are probably a better expert than I on the political impact that will have in Washington.
That was an irony too, right? Because in the course of these discussions, we had topics of energy, the new energy policy for the world, infrastructure corridors, or so-called, at least the words were used, but we didn't really hear much other than green energies. And with all of these discussions of energy, infrastructure that were used, not a single mention was made, as you mentioned, China was ignored, Russia was ignored, but nuclear power was also ignored as an even viable point of discussion, not even worthy of being discussed. Yeah. And the Bering Strait rail tunnel, which is something which everybody should have been talking about, especially for the Arctic, was not discussed at all. You posed a question at that very panel to the president of Iceland as well. Mm-hmm. Could you go through that a little bit and the reactions by the audience?
Review magazine, affiliated with the American economist Linda LaRouche. My question is for the president of Iceland. The Chinese premier was in Europe 2 months ago, officially declaring the Chinese policy of the New Silk Road and wanting cooperation with many European nations on railway projects, linking Beijing to Dresden and other ports all over Europe. At the same time, China has officially proposed to, on the Pacific side, to Canada and the United States to build a Bering Strait tunnel, linking the Bering Strait by rail. And this is a proposal also by Russia a couple of years ago. And it's a very serious proposal which Canada and the United States has ignored and although it being a recent Chinese policy, which the Chinese declared a month ago or 2 months ago, it's not even, let alone being discussed at this World Economic Forum. In my discussions with many people here, most people are oblivious to that it even exists, which is very strange. So, in my opinion, with the whole economic collapse, with the global economy so vulnerable, this is a very rational approach that if you have China proposing infrastructure corridors, Russia proposing infrastructure corridors between Siberia, China, and the Bering Strait, shouldn't Canada adopt this? So I want your thoughts on my comment.
Well, the acoustics here are so I'm not sure if I got every word correct of your question, but the core of it is that China and Russia, if I understand it correctly, are putting on the table various plans for infrastructure projects that could link Asia to Europe. And
through the Bering Strait, yes.
Yeah. Well, I think what we are seeing both in Russia and in China is considerable forward thinking in terms of logistics and transport and movement and how to use the northern part of the world in this respect. Very few of us in the other Arctic countries are aware or have studied, for example, that the Russian Duma has already created a legislative framework for the northeastern passage. And China is in its kind of long-term thinking. I always remember what Jiang Zemin, was the last of the previous president of China, said to me, the problem with you in the West is that you don't realize that for us in China 50 years is not a long time. So they think about this differently than we did. That's a very important point you're making. And they are looking at the globe, they're looking at the map, and they are taking the shipping lines, the railway lines, the infrastructure, the communication line, and they are putting on the table, and some of the research institutions and big companies wants to engage in this kind of a discussion. And I think it is very important that we are open-minded about it, in the same way as we are open-minded about research and science, and then formulate our view on the reaction to these plans. China and Russia could on their own create a system linking China through Russia to Europe, through railway transport in a big way, and then have a huge harbor somewhere in the Murmansk-Arkhangelsk area and transport the goods from there over to European or American harbors. And the rules of the game is that the ocean is open for cargo transport. And they could do it. They could do this on their own. They don't need anybody else to execute this kind of plan. But I think they realize that they will be better off and the country will be better with a more comprehensive cooperation.
Well, the reactions were many people were not aware of the Bering, that there is a way to connect the Bering Strait, that there is a proposal by China and Russia to build a Bering Strait. And they were very curious, and they were very open to that once you and I gave them a thorough overview of what it would mean and how this would completely be something, this would be in Canada's interest. Something that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, would not be in Canada's interest. Because this whole, the whole promotion about green movement, it's not really green. You can't green Africa with so-called green solar panels and windmills. 45% of available land in Africa is still uncultivated.
Yeah.
The rest of it is cultivated by backward irrigation methods. You need high-intense, you need energy flux-dense technologies, you need high-intense agricultural methods, something only that nuclear would bring, something that China's doing.
Yeah.
Because you had, there was a presentation by the Senegal minister where, Senegal a few years ago was about to build a nuclear power plant with the help of, I think, Russia or China. And they abandoned it after the Fukushima disaster and the chaos that was created around it to suppress global nuclear development. And what were they talking about? They have abandoned nuclear power. They're looking for aid. They're begging for aid for solar panels and windmills.
Yeah,
So,
that actually came up in a panel that I was a part of as well, or that I participated in and posed a question in as well, where everybody there, it was on the global food crisis, and everyone there was just discussing the need to think bottom up, local only, and the only solutions even permitted to be discussed involved only those things which don't change nature.
right.
Microcredit, subsistence farming. But then when I came in with my question on why it is that the global derivatives fraud, which is criminal because it's creating fluctuations in food price commodity speculation, in bioethanol bubbles, why this was not being discussed, and why it had become taboo. I even brought up to these panelists why it was taboo to even talk about things like the Transaqua program to take water from the Congo River Basin to move it up into the Lake Chad, which it's in the midst of being destroyed, and it's the heart of a major food crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought up several of these major projects that the Schiller Institute has been supporting. The panelists were completely blank-faced, had nothing to say. They moved on to the next question, but the audience was hungry for that type of intervention because the economics minister of Chad looked over and was smiling at me the whole time, who was there in the audience.
And you had a chance to talk to her.
Had a chance to talk to her. She was very hungry for these types of discussions. We left contact information, and we had a member of the Engineers Without Borders of Canada also, who was fascinated about these types of potentials. She didn't even realize that they could exist.
Right.
So the population here, the members were, in spite of the controlled discussion being had in many of the panels, many of the delegates were completely open-minded and hungry for these types of real solutions.
Most people are open to ideas, and most people don't realize that the world is in a crisis not because of lack of solutions, but because there's an oligarchy who has an intent to depopulate. As LaRouche has been saying, you have the Queen of England, you have an elite oligarchical bunch into the transatlantic system that have an intention to depopulate the world.
Yeah.
But the irony is that their whole system is bankrupt. Look at Europe. Look at the recent elections in Europe. You have a whole political earthquake where Europeans have rejected the free trade deals because they've done nothing for Europeans. They've brought in more austerity, more debt, more bailouts. So, and this is something that was also not brought up. The euro was promoted. I mean, they were still hanging on to the euro as being the model for global world governance. That euro has, despite the problems, euro has become more aggressive.
Yeah.
You had the Canadian minister at FAST at this conference who was promoting deregulation. How he was actually very happy. He was saying Canada has been one of the leading nations in the world. We abolished the wheat board. We abolished the voice of farmers for pricing wheat. We have abolished protectionist measures. He called protectionism as a global toxic threat to the economy. I mean, these are his words. So you have insanity, which ran this conference and intended, and it was an intention to not bring forward any solutions.
Well, that's certainly the plague that all of these conferences are finding themselves in, and the responsibility of our organization, both here in Montreal and across the continent of the North Americas, as well as South America, Europe, where we'll be intervening in many more of these conferences and bringing reality to the table, because if we don't, we know that not only is an economic collapse on the horizon, but the greatest war humanity has ever seen is being pushed between NATO countries, which are under the control of the British, and Russia, China, India, and other Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, which are going with the LaRouche program for massive technological development. So if we want to survive, we all here watching from your homes have to become active citizens, be very informed about the real policies like Glass-Steagall, national banking, NWAPA, the Bering Strait, that our movement has been at the forefront leading, and get active. So go to the website, make a contribution, call us up, and then become a citizen. Don't be a subject. Thank you.
Thank you.
Henry Kissinger and George Bush Sr. To usher in the new age of NAFTA, which had then in 1994 just been sealed as a treaty. Now, it being the 20th anniversary of that disaster, instead of it being an apology for dire mistakes that have led to the destruction of nation-states and the world's biggest economic collapse, obviously there's been a lack of humility, and instead what we've seen in the course of our interventions here has been nothing but thousands of delegates.
Situation right now, which is Russia and China, because if you're having a conference, a global economic conference, and you're not only not inviting but not at all mentioning Asia right now, especially Eurasian nations, Russia, China, India, it doesn't have to be. It's more than just oblivion or ignorance. It's an intention to push free trade down the throat of these nations and to reject what these nations are doing, to ignore and to play down the significant impact these nations are having on the global economic situation right now, which is moving away from free trade, moving towards development, physical economic development of these regions' internal economy. Right. So, even the recent Russia-China gas deal, the $400 billion gas deal that they just signed 2 weeks ago, I think, which would be a 30-year project, one of the biggest infrastructure projects ever.
Hello, this is Matthew Eric Kump with the Committee for the Republic of Canada. With me here is Avneet Thapar with also the Committee for the Republic of Canada. And we're here at the very last day of the International Economic Conference of the Americas, which was a 3-day event brought here to Montreal, Canada. It's the 20th anniversary of this event, which was originally established in 1994 by Paul Desmarais of Power Corporation with his London affiliates, a grouping of privy councillors and those affiliated with, and panelists, the likes of Christine Lagarde, Larry Summers, saying that the problem with the world isn't that we've had too much free trade and too much speculation, but rather
too
little. Yeah, not enough. So I'm going to ask Avneet here to just go through a few of the key points that we addressed and forced onto the table throughout the preceding 2 days at this conference.
Yeah, well, I think Matthew and myself were the only ones who pointed at the complete silliness and stupidity of the lack of two important global economic players in the world